Hi, everyone. Welcome to all of you. I'm Jeffrey Goldberg. I'm the Atlantic's editor-in-chief. Thank you for coming to us for this fourth installment of The Way Forward, which is a digital initiative hosted by The Atlantic in collaboration with Chatham House, the Emerson Collective, and the Peterson Institute for International Economics. Emerson Collective is, of course, the majority owner of The Atlantic. Just had to note that. One other note, you don't see this in your program, but at the end of this hour or end of this 45 minutes or so, we have an interview that I just did with Tony Blair, the former Prime Minister of the UK. Just taped it a little while ago. You'll want to stick around for that as well on the same general subject. Our goal of today's hour is to explore what the pandemic means for the future of democratic institutions across the world. What can we learn from previous global emergencies? What can be done to strengthen democratic norms in a time when democratic norms seem to be a bit on the back foot? Other very, very weighty questions for which The Atlantic and our partners specialize. We're going to dive into all this soon. Before I do, I just want to remind everyone that you can be part of this conversation. You could type your questions in the Q&A box, which is on the bottom of your screen. Keep your questions in the form of questions. That's always very useful. Keep them short, on topic. You might want to direct them to one of the people in particular in our first segment. And we have a global audience today because we're a very globalist, I guess. And so we'd love to know where you're from. So put that in your question as well. I want to go now to our first two guests who, as luck would have it, are both Atlantic writers. Go figure. Anne Applebaum, of course, is a staff writer, Pulitzer Prize winner for The Atlantic, specialist in many things, including and especially the history and consequences of totalitarianism, authoritarianism. And we have Yascha Mounk, who is a contributing writer for our magazine and does many, many things. He's an associate professor at Johns Hopkins, at SAIS, the School for Advanced International Studies. He's with the German Marshall Fund. He's very, very busy at many, many think tanks doing very, very heavy thinking. They're both very well known in their fields. Let's jump right in. They also know each other fairly well, so feel free to cut each other off. I don't think either one of you will be offended by that. Anne, I always wanted to say, give us the view from Poland, and I could say that because you're actually in Poland. What are the Polish people thinking today about the future of democracy? And let's start with you. I just said in a kind of almost, it's a reflex to say this now, but that democracy is on the back foot. It was on the back foot before the pandemic. I guess the question is, how much more on the back foot is it as a global movement right now? And Yascha, you can jump in on that question as well.
So thanks, Jeff, for that introduction that reminded everyone that I'm in fact in Poland. It's true. One of the oddities of this pandemic is that, although all of us would like to keep talking about the world in the same way we were talking about it 6 months ago, is that actually the pandemic has divided nations in a different way from might have been expected. In other words, what you see when you look around the world right now is not a kind of democracy versus autocracy division, whereby, we're all talking about the democracies doing well or badly, or the dictatorships doing well or badly. What you're seeing is a division between countries that have a lot of public trust and that have bureaucracies and civic and public institutions that function well. And that means that countries like Taiwan or South Korea, or it increasingly appears Germany or Slovakia, turn out to be countries that are doing pretty well in the crisis, and their democratically elected leaderships are also doing well, and I think will, in the long term benefit. On the other side, we have other democracies like the United States, and to some extent Great Britain, and one or two others, which are not doing so well and have failed to cope with the pandemic because their politics are very polarizing, because They don't create cultures of trust where people are willing to cooperate for the sake of the whole society and so on. And so and then actually autocracies divide in a similar way. Some are doing better, some are doing worse, depending on how well they function. In fact, most of them are functioning rather badly. So, one of the, I think, things that's going to come out of this is not so much that, democracy is up or democracy is down, but that certain kinds of democracy and certain kinds of democratic leaders and certain forms of particularly of democratic, certain kinds of democratic states turn out to be better at dealing with this kind of crisis than others, and they will in turn engender, I think, greater trust and support as this goes on. And so whereas you might see in the US, you may see further breakdown, you may see further mood swing against democracy. In Germany or in Slovakia, you might see the opposite. I'll say that with just one caveat, which is that if you look back in history, every time there's been a plague or a pandemic, they always create cult movements, kind of political splintering, forms of madness, forms of insane religiosity. And this one is no exception. And we see, really actually in every country, you see the beginnings of little splinter movements and groups and conspiracy theorists, and they're the 5G ones and the, and the Chinese ones, and there are lots and lots of different people believing different things, including previously quite sensible people.
I thought you were just describing the White House. I'm sorry, I didn't realize that. I didn't realize it was bigger than that.
Yeah, there's the White House. Here I have a group of quite normally sober friends who've been sending me 5G conspiracy theories. Have you heard this? And do you realize that? And I was just talking to a friend in London who's had the same experience, that people are coming out of the woodwork. In a way, people are sort of driven insane by the loss of normality. And you may see a lot of weird splintering and fringe stuff developing, which also affects politics.
Yeah. Yascha, I want you to take Anne's answer and run with it, but also do one other thing if you can. As an inside outsider, you're a German, but you're in the U.S., studying the U.S., teaching in the U.S. You're actually in the cradle of democracy right now in Virginia, in fact. It looks like you're in the basement of Mount Vernon, in fact. Talk about your reaction to how our democratic system is working right now. And are you as surprised as other Germans, and I've been reading a little bit of the press there, at the befuddled, let's be fair about, the befuddled American response to the pandemic? And what does it say about the health of American democracy? I just loaded a lot onto your plate. Try to deal with it efficiently if you can.
I'll answer all the questions in 20 seconds.
Please.
Look, I have been. I've lived in the United States for about 12 years now. I'm a proud American citizen. I feel very at home here. And in those 12 years, I often spoke to people who grew up in Germany, who were German, and they said, I miss so many things about Germany. I miss the bread and the trains and whatnot. And, while I like German bread too, and while I certainly can get frustrated, with the Amtrak, I never had this sort of visceral feeling of what Germans call Heimweh, this sort of longing for home. Actually, the first time that I felt some version of it has been over the last weeks and months, because looking at the far from perfect, the in some ways too slow, at certain points chaotic German response, when nevertheless there was clear leadership that's trying to be unifying. There's a national plan. They are actually putting in place a testing and tracing regime at the federal level. And there's some hope that the country is now opening up in a rational way. Whereas in the United States, you've seen, complete chaos, complete abnegation of responsibility at the top. And yes, an amazing amount of failure of state capacity. There was a global health survey a year or two ago where researchers tried to place countries by their capacity to dealing with a global health emergency. The United States came out top. Well, I think that was a mistake. Clearly, all of that state capacity we have on paper, all the great talent we have in the CDC and other institutions cannot be mobilized in a crisis, at least when we have an administration like we have right now, but perhaps those failings go deeper. I think it's actually plausible to fear that. Now, I do want to say something about the state of democracy around the world. I think Anne spoke very well, mostly about sort of which democracies dealt with the virus well and which didn't. And I think she's right that that's going to have an impact on democracy success. If we see in this moment that autocratic countries really succeed and democracies all fail, that would have a very long-lasting negative impact on the state of democracy. Thankfully, as Anne emphasized, that's not the case. But I think there's another way of thinking about it, which is what is the impact of this virus going to be on different democratic systems? And I think, roughly speaking, there's sort of three quick observations. One is that in countries where authoritarian populists were already gaining more and more power, this is really their moment to concentrate power in their own hands and obliterate the opposition. That's happened in Hungary, it's happening in the Philippines, as Anne will tell you, I think it's happening to a significant degree in Poland as well. So we'll see a whole bunch of countries being lost to democracy in the short and medium run, in part because of COVID-19 as a kind of moment where authoritarians can exploit this. I think the second thing is that there is a way in which the basic narrative of right-wing populists has been vindicated better than I could have dreamt up 3 months ago. The basic narrative seems, at least, to hold true. I don't ultimately believe it, that the world is a very dangerous place. We need very radical action to protect people. We need to close down borders. We need to get rid of globalization, all of those things. And I think that is going to have an overhang. It will make some of those far-right populist arguments sound more plausible to many people. Now, on the other hand, I also think there's a real countervailing factor, and I'm hoping that that will ultimately be the most significant. And that's that you're seeing that those very people who in some ways have a narrative that seems to fit the moment, who promise to protect their populations from great dangers around the world, are utterly, miserably failing. That Donald Trump and Jair Bolsonaro, and by the way, AMLO in Mexico, and all kinds of other populists, most on the right, some on the left, are not capable of decent, sensible, competent governance of a form that actually saves lives right now. And I think the sort of warnings that people like Anne and I have made about populism for a very long time, saying, hey, be careful, this kind of lack of respect for expertise, lack of respect for independent institutions, that's going to affect your life. That seemed very abstract 6 months ago. It unfortunately does not seem so abstract now.
Well, let me ask both of you this question, jumping off that. I mean, you're describing a pattern in which, if you're looking at reality in Brazil, in the US, for instance, you'd say, oh, well, the populists should be on the back foot because they're not managing this great challenge well. On the other hand, the nature of populist rulers is to figure out ways to manipulate people to believe something that isn't true. So, I mean, I guess the question is, how much reality do the people of the United States need? How much reality do the people of Mexico or Brazil need? I use reality in a very loaded way. How much bad reality do they need before they go, oh, you know what? This isn't working.
Yeah, you know, it's a very good point. I mean, a friend of mine described 2020 as the year that reality reemerges, you know, and takes revenge on 2016. And when people see that actually you can die from something and it's not just, you know, a hoax that's been dreamt up by, you know, by CNN and you know, I mean, look, I think a lot, this is going to be an annoying answer, but a lot is going to depend on what happens. You know, a lot depends on,
you know, this is why we pay you the moderately big bucks.
That's right. No, a lot depends on how many people do get sick, how well your local hospital copes, the kinds of personal experiences that people have with the disease itself. You know, at the point where it's just a purely theoretical, I mean, I am in the middle of nowhere in the Polish countryside, and no one around me is sick. And here there is a feeling of unreality. You know, they're talking about something in Warsaw and none of us can really feel it or touch it. And why should we really care about it? And I can hear people around me talking like that. And so in that sense, I have some understanding of what people in West Texas, you know, or rural Montana must feel like right now, that it's this theoretical thing happening in New York, you know, or on TV. And therefore, you know, why do we take it seriously? The progress of the disease and then the way in which people cope with it in particular communities is going to have a lot of impact on how people on how people cope with that. I mean, if it somehow burns out, I mean, if it goes away magically by April, maybe not, but if it, if we hit a number by which it's not reproducing quickly and it starts to fade away, then lots of people will say, well, what was that all about? It was a hoax, and so on. And so the way in which individuals encounter the disease, the way in which they see it affecting their friends and families, the way they hear and see local hospitals, I mean, and all of that is kind of still to come. We're at the really very beginning of this, crisis. We're at the moment when it's hit major cities and places that are, close to big international airports. And we haven't gotten to the part of the crisis where it begins to really infect rural communities and spread like that. And that's at the moment when we'll learn, actually, what's real to people? Is what's real the thing that's on your phone or on your Facebook page, or is what's real, your cousin going to the hospital? And I actually don't know the answer. We'll find out.
To bastardize a much more elegant saying.
Doesn't it have some of it to do with the power of the individual authoritarian-minded leader to manipulate people? The verbal power, the manipulative power?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's why I have very different projections about the trajectory of people who are already very entrenched in power and those who are not. I mean, if you already have enough control of a political system that, like Viktor Orban in Hungary, you can say, I'm abolishing the parliament for the time being, I have a right to rule by decree. If you criticize me on social media, or to put it in the official language, if you spread false rumors on social media, you are going to be arrested and you might go to jail. And by the way, most of the media already are singing in tune with the government hymn sheet. Then you probably can control a lot of a narrative, and you reinforce your capture of a political system. I think in a place like the United States, or in a place like Brazil, where there's certainly authoritarian erosions going on, but there is still a very vibrant press, there are still some independent institutions, that's much less likely. Look, to bastardize a much more elegant saying, some people might deny reality all of the time. A lot of people might deny reality some of the time, but I don't think you can get a lot of people to deny reality all of the time. And I think, as Anne was saying, reality is going to hit home today. Now, not for everybody, but that's not necessary, right? When you think of something like the election we have coming up in the United States, is there going to be 20, 25% of the population, probably more, that's going to remain fervently convinced that Donald Trump is their savior and he's the only person who can actually protect them? Absolutely. But he will need a lot more than that in order to eke out a victory. And when I look at some of his slogans at the moment, I'm struck by how weak they are. I mean, what he's been tweeting for the last days is transition to greatness, exclamation mark. That reminds me of Selina Meyer, or perhaps of jab, exclamation mark. It does not remind me of a very effective rhetorically campaign of 2016. So how do you sell, I'm going to make America great again 4 years ago. He was going to say, I've made America great. Well, that's really tone deaf at the moment. So now he's reduced to transition to greatness. That's not a very selling message to the people he needs to win.
Yeah, that reminds me actually of the communists used to always talk about, well, we've reached the fourth stage before communism, and we still have to just keep trying until we get to the next stage. It's a very poor authoritarian tactic. Keep telling people, well, we're not there yet. You just need to believe harder or try harder. I mean, I would say the other danger in the U.S. is actually there is a weird similarity between the U.S. and here, where I'm in Poland, which is that when you have very polarized societies, there is a way in which the virus and reaction to the virus may divide people further. Yascha, you were talking about how certain kinds of authoritarians will be entrenched further. There's also the possibility that polarized societies will be polarized further. In the US, you will have a kind of reality community that listens to doctors, and then you'll have an unreality community that listens to conspiracy theories on Facebook. And you have something like that here as well, where the divisions between people that opened up over the last several years have just grown larger, and people are farther away from this. So the way in which the virus can make, it almost acts like an X-ray. Whatever is wrong with your society, it kind of emphasizes it or makes it worse. And conversely, in societies where things do work rather well, as we've talked about Germany, but there are others, it may show people that, you know, they have a lot of solidarity and social trust and so on. It may be a reinforcement of democracy.
But I want to go, thank you, Anne. I want to go to one or two questions from our audience. By the way, transition to greatness is my slogan for when I decide to wear actual pants rather than sweatpants. That's my transition to greatness every day. There's a question from Gasper. How do you repair the mythic narrative of America, the deep beliefs that make a we the people democracy possible? It's a very good question. It's about e pluribus unum. We don't feel, in a slightly different context, Jim Mattis used to say that Americans have lost affection for one another, and that is a national security threat greater than any other individual national security threat. How do you repair a fractured, let's talk about America. You can talk about other countries as well if you want, but how do you make people believe they're part of the same narrative and that their identities and that their futures are tied up one with another?
Well, you know, I'm actually optimistic about that in reality, even if not in the abstract, which is to say that when you ask people how united are we, when you ask people, you know, how much do we have in common, you get varying answers. For actually, some recent polls say that a large majority of the country thinks that we have more in common than what divides us. And by the way, those numbers are even higher among Latinos and African Americans than among whites. The group among which the feeling that we have something in common is untrue, is actually the ones who are perhaps most likely to be Atlantic readers, which is to say highly educated, left-leaning people. So actually, I think the country thinks we have something in common.
We have all kinds of people, Yascha, but I go ahead.
Well, that's absolutely. But I also think that, you know, when you look at how people interact in the real world, not on Twitter, not when there's a political campaign, there is a natural way in which a pluribus unum is still true. There is a unified American culture, and perhaps it takes an immigrant to notice that. For all of the wonderful diversity of this country, walking into a bar or a restaurant or a Starbucks or a public space or a government office in the United States feels very different from Britain, very different from Germany, and as Anne will tell you, I'm sure, very different from Poland. There is a natural script for how people interact. And by the way, when the Olympics are on, somebody in the northern part of Michigan, who's a couple of miles away from Canada, is going to cheer for the guy from Los Angeles who's really far away from him, who may have a different ethnicity, a different religion, but they're both American, and he wants that guy to win over the person who may have grown up 5 miles to the north across the Canadian border. I think there is a strong sense of a pluribus unum, and as intellectuals, we sometimes lose sight of that.
Right. Anne, I want you to answer that, but let me throw in one more question, our final question. Maybe you can grapple with both of them. Deb Bitton asks, social media has given equal standing to lies in opposition to what used to be trusted sources of news and information. How can democracy survive with no accepted version of the truth, in scare quotes?
So funny you should ask that, but it's something I've been thinking about a lot. I mean, you know, we're at the beginning of this information revolution, and we're at a stage that you know, you can compare it to the invention of the printing press, which was also a moment of great political chaos and change. And we're still learning how to, you know, how to use it and how to think about, you know, new ways of confirming and, you know, basically persuading people to read and understand and grow closer to facts rather than accepting disinformation. You know, we haven't yet thought much as a society about, first of all, how we might eventually begin to regulate social media. And this is a big topic, and there are a lot of different ways we could go into it. Probably not enough time to do so on this one chat. Because we certainly regulated the press, you know, in the olden days, and we certainly regulated radio and television. You know, there were licenses, there were libel laws, there were other tools that we used to add more reality and less fiction and less slander to the media. And we also haven't yet thought very much about, do we want there to be some kind of public service social media? So is there some equivalent of the BBC that you could create online? That, you know, that also, and this is also partly the answer to the previous question, you know, are there themes you could talk about? Are there ways you could discuss things, you know, that could be acceptable to different political groups? I mean, maybe you'd have to choose subjects carefully, but are there, you know, is there a 21st century 21st century equivalent to that, to kind of public service information, even just to have available as a choice. I'm not saying it should be the only thing you can find online. But we haven't yet thought much about what are the new channels of information, because one of the things that we've learned about combating disinformation is that a lot of things we imagined would work, like fact checking and so on, don't really work. And what's needed instead is forms of information that create trust and that build communities around sources of trust. And it may be that we just need to think harder about how to do that on social media. So,
what does that look like in practical terms?
So call me in about a year and I'll tell you. This is one of the things that I want to do. But as I said, try to imagine, you know, the BBC or something like the BBC online. In other words, a source of information that is designed to reach people, you know, of different age groups in different parts of the country, you know, using different channels, that seeks to build trust in different kinds of communities, that creates content or news or information or documentaries or programs that are designed to do exactly what Yascha was talking about a second ago, which is to build unity. I mean, it's, as I said, these are questions that have been grappled with before. They were grappled with at the beginning of the broadcast revolution. So maybe it's something that we could begin to do in the next year or two.
Thank you, Anne. One final, very, very quick question for Yascha. Germany is a different experience, obviously coming out of World War II, than America in terms of untrammeled free speech, right? You can't be a Nazi in Germany. It's illegal. Do you think that in order to defend democracy, the idea of democracy, we have to impose German-level strictures on the way people express themselves?
I don't know, for a couple of reasons. The first is that there's lots of countries with restricted free speech in which populists have taken over in terrifying ways, including Turkey and India and many others around the world. And the second of which is that I think people always make the wrong argument for freedom of speech. They talk about all the wonderful things that will flow from freedom of speech, all the wonderful debates and the way we'll learn from each other and we might correct our opinion and so on. And those are all important. They don't pay enough attention to the negative things that flow from giving some people control over our speech. And I think one of them is that they actually make elections more totalizing. But if I fear that if you win the election, I'm not going to be able to say what I want afterwards, I have all the more reason to just go all out and play dirty as much as I can. And the second is that we just simply have no reason to trust that the right decisions are always going to be taken. Right now, it might be that the government outlaws opinions I don't like, but as soon as a populist is in power, and that's now a realistic prospect in every democracy in the world, those same laws can be used in order to shut up the people who are rightly criticizing those populists. So I think we have to defend freedom of speech, and we can very well defend democracy, even when very unpleasant people get to say very unpleasant things.
Yascha, thank you very, very much. Anne, thank you very, very much. It's great to see you both in 2D. Hope to see you in 3D at some point in the near future. Thanks very much for joining us.